of the Prime Minister, Ariel Henry. A former US ambassador who pleaded guilty to spying for Cuba has been jailed for 15 years. Victor Manuel Rocha was arrested in December. The US Vice President Kamala Harris has blamed Donald Trump for the loss of abortion rights in Arizona. Her comments followed the state Supreme Court's decision to impose a total ban on the procedure. Mr. Trump has said the court had gone too far. A new US study has found that rates of sterilization spiked after the national right to an abortion was overturned by the US Supreme Court. Researchers from the University of Pittsburgh School of Public Health found that the rise was both higher and more sustained for young women than for men. A court in Ecuador has ruled that the arrest of the country's former Vice President Jorge Glass during last week's raid on the Mexican embassy was illegal, but it said he must remain in jail due to his previous conviction. Consumer price rises in Argentina have slowed for a third consecutive month, but annual price inflation still remains staggeringly high at almost 290%. President Javier Milei has devalued the currency and introduced tough austerity measures. Tiger Woods has made golfing history after making the halfway cut at the Masters tournament for a record 24th consecutive time. The 48-year-old has won the event 5 times. Tributes have been paid to the Italian designer Roberto Cavalli, who's died at the age of 83. His designs were known for their use of snakeskin and animal print, as well as transparent materials. That's the latest BBC News.
From the BBC World Service, in association with ABC and Akashvani, this is Stumped.
Hello and welcome to Stumped, your intercontinental hit of news, features and debate from the quirky world of cricket. I'm Charu Sharma for Akashvani. Today up in the, should I say, Lower Himalayas, beautiful little home. It's just fabulous here environmentally and every which other way. The lack of population as well just calms you down. So hopefully I'll be very calm, Charu Sharma, today. Great weather outside, by the way.
Jim Maxwell for the ABC here in Sydney. It's getting a little bit cooler, but still enough heat around the place to make you feel as though cricket could easily be played here. Yeah, they could play 12 months of the year, but instead we're just taking in a little bit of feed of IPL if we can stay awake late enough to watch it, because that's the best cricket show in town at the moment.
And I'm Nikesh Regani for the BBC this week. Not at all jealous about Jarrod in the Himalayas or Jim there in sunny old Sydney. It's the start of the cricket season. It's April and we've had rain for the last week or so. Just typical, although I'm pleased to report that the sun is shining today here at Leicester.
Well, good to see you both, Jim, Nikesh. And on this week's show, let's begin with debating who is the toughest cricketer from both past and present and what defines their character. We're going to be joined a little later by somebody who's actually written a book on this subject. But here in India, we're always looking for a new hero. They tend to emerge from the IPL, and we may potentially have our next big star. I'm talking about the 21-year-old Mayank Yadav, who really turned up the pace and was player of the match in his IPL debut match for the Lucknow Super Giants. He was bowling some not only great pace, but with great control as well. He clocked 96 miles per hour. For those who follow kilometers per hour, probably around 157 or so serious pace, as I said. That was against RCB, and it's the quickest delivery of the season so far. You can imagine the galaxy of fast bowlers, but Mayank Yadav has beaten more on that score. Picked up 6 wickets and 41 runs in his first 2 matches. And Nikesh, you've been keeping an eye on the IPL for the BBC. Your thoughts on this fiery new star?
Look, as you say, it's really exciting when you get somebody bowling with that genuine pace. Everybody's eyes are glued onto the action for those 4 overs or so that he's in action. And look, it's one of those phenomenons that's been going along ever since I was a child, and I remember the likes of Shoaib Akhtar, Alan Donald a little bit before that as well, but Shoaib Akhtar, Brett Lee, Sean Tate. You know, we've seen some exciting speedsters over the years, you know, just that raw pace. And in India, it's something which has been quite rare up until maybe a couple of years ago when someone like Umran Malik came in and bowled similar speed, sort of touching that 95, 96 miles an hour into the late 150 kilometers per hour. I think the difference and the most exciting thing about somebody like Mayank Yadav is not only the pace, it's the accuracy. And when you can match those two things up, you are a lethal weapon. And he has proved so far in the games that he's played. I think that was the one thing that somebody like an Umran Malik was missing. He found himself out of his IPL franchise side in this season's competition because he just was a little bit wayward. But when you've got somebody like a Mayank Yadav who's so accurate, so quick, and when he gives interviews, he says, I'm not bothered about being the fastest bowler in the world, I just want to be the best. Those are all great ingredients for somebody who's got a lot of potential at just the age of 21. So really, really exciting to see this kid prosper. How do you sort of, being in India, the pressure that some of these young superstars come under. What kind of challenges do you think he's going to face now that he's being talked about in that light, in terms of perhaps being selected for India so early?
Well, the first challenge, of course, is to stay fit, where already he has a bit of a problem because in his third match, he bowled only one over, got to about 140 kilometers or so, well below his quickest, and then had to, not limp off, I believe he had a side strain. And the management thought, thankfully, that it should be taken off and repaired a bit, which I think is going to take some time. So already, bowling at that pace is going to cause a bit of a problem physically for young Mayank. He's only 21, hopefully he'll recover quickly enough. But, side strains are one of those funny things where so much of it is used for the draw from fast bowling. It might take a long time. And for me, it's all about fitness. I do think, the little I know him, that he has a very steady head on his shoulders. The problem that you mentioned is all to do with the kind of success and fame and everything else that goes with somebody who is a potential star. In that respect, even though he's young and he hasn't tasted much of, the cricketing success, I think he will do fairly well. So that's one of the sweeter aspects of Mayank Yadav, where he's not likely to lose his head. But, I do have to ask you, Jim, because you've got these speedsters, in Australia coming up, with every populated part of Australia. He says that he's not quite worried about bowling fast, but that is his USP. And do you think this pressure of having to bowl fast all the time and all the rest of the expectations, have they told on speedsters in the past for not to their benefit, for quite the fact that they kind of disintegrate a little quickly?
I think as we've noticed over a period of time, there are meteors that arrive in the game of cricket, young, fast bowlers, who make an instant impact because of their pace. Their durability is the problem. And we're not getting much of an examination so far on a youngster who's playing in T20 cricket. I mean, if you're going to build up the durability to be a serious pace bowler in 50 over in test match cricket, you need to get very fit, because more than likely your body's going to betray you at the age of 21, as it did for Pat Cummins, thinking of recent history in Australian cricket. But it's the most exciting thing, I reckon, in cricket, is the young, fast bowler. You think of Shoaib Akhtar when he blazed onto the scene. It really is dynamic cricket watchers to see whether or not a bloke who's quick can get away with it, can intimidate the batsman, can knock his stumps over, a bit like Shamar Joseph did to the Australians just recently in a test match. But whether or not these guys have got the durability to sustain it is the question. And I'm fascinated not just with this young fellow, but with what has happened in Indian cricket in its maturing professional age, where the rewards are so good. We've seen fast bowlers, I mean, places. Bumrah, where did he come from? We never saw these fellas going back to the days of Prasanna Chandrasekhar, Venkatravan and Bader. When a bloke who came on called Gavaskar and bowled 2 overs, they rubbed the ball on the ground and they chucked it to the spinners. Now we've got fast bowlers in India who can actually rip through teams. So from that viewpoint, this is very exciting. But in the immediate term, just keep a cool head. I hope he does too, in the hope that he will develop from this very exciting start.
Yeah, well, he's not the tallest and not the biggest either, but, so one wonders where he generates the pace from. But yes, you make a good point. I think India, all the Indian cricket fans are delighted at the number of fast bowlers coming through the system and the ranks, and maybe it's a combination of many things, including, of course, just better training and
I love the... It's a great way to get in touch with the world of cricket. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Well, from Brazil, what do you know? Leandro, thanks so much. And if you want to get involved in the show, why not send up a WhatsApp voice note? The number you need to remember is +44 800 032 0470. Say that again, +44 800 032 0470. Do please, of course, include your name and where you're from. You know we'd love to hear from you.
From the BBC World Service, this is Stumped on ABC and Akashvani.
Next on Stumped, cricketers are many things, but what makes them tough? Is it their pride, their tenacity, or their willingness to not lie down, not give up? Well, former cricket journalist Richard Sydenham has written a book called Cricket's Hard Men, which considers players from across the world looking beyond their achievements and into their character and personality. And I'm glad to say that Richard now joins us on Stump. Richard, thanks so much for your time.
No problem, Cheru. Nice to be on.
Well, firstly, Richard, what is it that in your mind makes cricketers tough? What defines them? What would you think would be the two primary criteria?
Well, it's obviously it's tough to define in short, because it's easy to think someone's hard just for being good against fast bowling. I didn't want to fill a book with players who are merely good against fast bowling, otherwise you'd be seeing people like Graham Goodson or Gavaskar. It become, I think, very predictable, so I didn't want that. I wanted to scratch beneath the surface and dig a bit deeper, find out about the true tough characters through history. And I think ultimately, it's players who just get the job done. I think someone like Alan Border in 1989 suffered a couple of Ashes series defeats. What did he do? He was great mates with David Garrity, and both of them he decided, you know what, I'm not going to speak to these guys for a summer. That to me was just one example of toughness there. It's quite hard to, Garrett admitted it to me, that he found it quite disconcerting that this great mate of his over the last decade suddenly started blanking him. That is one example to me of the guy who was prepared to go that extra step and just get the job done, do what he needed to do.
Richard, Jim Maxwell here in Sydney, and I noticed the forward was done by the former Australian coach John Buchanan. Very, very tough business. Who's the toughest of Alan Border's right up there, obviously. How did it come about that you got hold of John Buchanan, and what did he have to say in his forward?
Well, yeah, I know John from my journalism days, and we're in touch now. Since I've left the journalism world and became an agent, we have a few conversations. Obviously, what he's achieved in cricket, very much respect his thoughts, particularly on the psychological side of the game. And yeah, he had a few interesting things to say, quite a lot actually, as you'd expect. It was funny the way he said when he walked into the Queensland dressing room at first as their new coach and tried to persuade Alan Border that we should start looking at the data in terms of how we play the game, and I think he suddenly realised there's certain players you don't say that to, and Alan Border was one of them. But moving on from that, he gave a couple of examples of the toughness of that Australia team he coached. interestingly, I think although we rate him as a fantastic fast bowler, not many people think of Glenn McGrath as being an obvious tough guy or a hard man, but he gave the example of how he carried on fronting up the Aussie bowling attack even when he was going through those tough times with his wife with the cancer. So that was just an example of how players show toughness, not necessarily in a way that we see it between a battle of bat and ball, but other elements that come into it like that. So yeah, John spoke about that as well. Jim?
Richard Nikesh here from the BBC. Obviously, a lot of your book focuses on the psychology and the mental health of those cricketers as well. Why do you think that was so important to get into the book, and what did you ultimately learn about that aspect of the game?
Well, I think it's easy just to talk about cricketers being tough from what they do as a batsman or a bowler, whether they're taking on bouncer after bouncer, or someone like Dennis Lillee who bowled with a broken back for 18 months. These are the obvious sort of examples on cricket terms, but I think we needed to scratch a bit deeper and ask ourselves why they're such tough characters. And I think the three chapters I wrote on the elements you suggest, one on about the mental health challenges in cricket now, one's called Beating the Demons, and another is more about the stress element of the game. But take the example of Beating the Demons. I don't think there's one cricketer out there who's ever played the game at the highest level who ever had doubts about himself or facing a certain batsman or bowler at any point. And I think Viv Richards made a good point. You'd think the great Viv Richards never doubted himself, but he did. But Viv's way of dealing with it, you know, sums up with Beating the Demons is he lies to himself in his head and says, you know what, this bowler is not good enough to take on Viv Richards today. He says, but before you know it, you start believing it. So deep down, you know you don't fancy this bowler. But by the time you tell yourself that over and over, actually, you've got no doubts. He just had pure conviction in his own game. I guess someone like Ian Botham would have been another good example of that. He would never have told you he was frightened of taking on a bowler. Deep down, he might well have been.
Obviously, it's called Cricket's Hard Men, kind of does what it says on the front cover there. Did you think about featuring female cricketers too? Could that be version 2 of your next book? Because you know, we were talking before we came on air, and producer Charlotte and I were discussing hard female cricketers. We came up with an example of Catherine Sciver-Brunt, who's quite scary when you're facing her out there in the middle. Is that something that you might look to feature in the future?
It was definitely a consideration when I was putting the book together, but and I'm sure it's no disrespect to any of the women in that game. I just felt that I wanted to have a more historic angle to the book. For instance, Douglas Jardine's in the book for his hardness of the way he took on the traditionalists and did things different. So I just felt that the men's game had that more history, but maybe, as you say, maybe a few more years. There's definitely scope there to add women to it.
We are shortly going to debate between us, Jim and Nikesh, who we think are some other top cricketers. But after all that research and all talking to so many players, do you have a personal favourite, hardest man in the game?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess it's probably the most obvious one you'd think of when we go back to the 50s, 60s and 70s. It's Brian Close, famous Yorkshire and England player. I was fortunate enough to have an hour interviewing him before he sadly passed away, and it was probably about an hour of duration, this interview, and he was chuckling all the way through it. And I just felt that he couldn't actually believe himself, reflecting back on the way he played the game, the way he just kept taking these blows and carrying on. And you know, we talk about boys' own stuff, and even people like Viv Richards and Ian Botham idolised him when he was at Somerset. They looked up to him, and I guess that's why they were two tough players themselves. And Peter Roebuck, who I managed to speak to before he passed away as well, he said he saw an innings of Closey after that, when he took all those blows against the West Indies in '76. He saw him take on Bob Willis and get hit, and he said that he he'd never seen bravery like it, you know, some of the blows he used to take and carry on. But I'll tell you, just before I go, one thing I'd like to say about Closey, and we talk about cricket's hard men. When I play the game in league cricket, I hate to hear that element of people saying, you know, when they start sledging each other and they threaten to take it into the dressing rooms after. That's not hard. Brian Close never sledged a single person throughout his career. He was hard because not only could he take the blows, played the game in the right way, he only ever thought about winning, and I love that element that he's the hardest guy in my opinion and many of people's opinions, but still remained a great competitor in the right spirit, and I just thought, you know, that's something we should all remember.
Richard, you know, you make a great point about the spirit of the game. And for that reason alone, I'm delighted with your choice. Thanks so much. I know the book's going to do well, and it's going to probably generate a lot of comments as well about some people coming up with their own hard men and so on and so forth. So thank you so much for joining us on Stumped, and good luck with the book.
Thanks, guys. Great to be on.
Now, Jim, Nikesh, you heard Richard, and perhaps it's time to also feature a couple of personal favorites. Jim, if you want to go first, because I know Aussies are generally tough anyway. Now, you might agree with his choices or not, but do you have somebody in the book or outside of that as somebody you want to mention as, you know, all the attributes that Richard mentioned, or your own as well, as a tough cricketer?
Well, there are many examples of toughness. One that's come to mind while we've been having this chat was the extraordinary performance by Dean Jones in that Madras Chennai Tide Test many years ago, when he was physically ill because of the heat out in the middle. He got a double century in that game, and Alan Board, a tough guy, just walked over to him and said, "Oh, you're not feeling very well? Well, if you're not tough enough to keep on batting, we'll get another Queenslander out here to show you how to do it." That kind of thing. And obviously Board is one of the toughest. But for mine, going back to growing up, I always thought Bill Lawrie was hard to beat, particularly in '61. He got that 100 at the Ridge at Lords. And when he was captain, he was a tough, mean captain in many ways. I'll never forget it, being in the West Indies dressing room in '68-9, when he did not enforce the follow-on, batted again and left him 742 to win the game. And I still remember Sobers carry on about, how can man play cricket like this? Well, that was Bill. He was tough, and it made sure Australia wrapped up the series. But goodness gracious, I'm excluding bowlers. So many bowlers over the years that have been tough. Anyway, look, I'm a bit of an Australian flavour. I'm sure there are plenty of other people around the place in other countries, particularly as I think of it when Graham Smith came out to face Mitchell Johnson with a broken hand. That was another example of many of Graham Smith's bravery as a player. So we can chronicle this forever. And as the time limit, I mean, can we go back to the 1890s?
No,
they certainly didn't wear helmets in those days.
Well, true. I think that has that's a major factor when it comes to hard men. Because a lot of people might want to distinguish
See, look, when you're talking about hard men, there are so many of these lists that have done the rounds across different sports over the years. You could categorise them in different ways. There could be hard men in terms of who would you least like to sort of come up against maybe off the field, and you look at people like Merv Hughes and he's quite an intimidating character, or you know, some of the great West Indians like Colin Croft, you wouldn't want to take him on, I mean, either with, you know, facing his bowling or off the field. And then you've got your sort of pantomime guys, haven't you, who maybe like to give the impression that they're a little bit tough, the Andre Nells of this world and the Srisants, who wouldn't really make any kind of list if you were being serious about it. But then for me, the all-time great, and we've mentioned it before, is Steve Waugh, because you always get asked that question, and I'm a batter, and I was always a top-order batter, so I've got that little bit of bias towards the batters in the game. But Steve Waugh is one of those who you put up there on the top of that list of who you want to bat for your life, in sort of my era of watching cricket, certainly anyway. And that just comes from his mental toughness, his physical toughness, the fact that he never gives an inch. He looks grumpy, he is pretty grumpy on the field, but he's got an outstanding brain there. And, you know, when it comes to losing positions to winning positions. For me, he just epitomises everything that great Australian side was about, the one that won 16 Test matches in a row, and that you don't do without being a really tough character, a tough bunch of characters, really, that whole entire setup was. But he was their leader, and for me, there's none tougher than him. If you're looking in sort of terms of modern-day cricket, you might say somebody like a Virat Kohli was pretty tough, still is pretty tough out there on the field, but, you know, a lot of that, there's theatrics involved with it, whereas with Steve Waugh, he didn't need any of that. It was just, you know, straight, focused, and just get the job done.
Yeah, well, I can't argue with those choices at all, but let me give it a subcontinental flavor, if you don't mind. For different reasons, now we all know what he did in the world of cricket in terms of batting, but I would like you gentlemen to just put your thinking cap on about the kind of pressures that he lived with all his playing life. And I mentioned a 16-year-old who made his debut against the best bowlers in the world in Pakistan, Sachin Tendulkar. So it's not just the fact that he, at 5'5" or whatever, was facing crazy bowling through his life, but also, much more important, is the fact that he played the game in fabulous spirit, and the kind of weight that he tolerated of, 1 billion people every time he went into bat. That also called for a special kind of toughness to shut all that out and get on with the business. I remember doing the show once again with Sachin Tendulkar in the past, and the gentleman who was funding the show just kept questioning me with this astounded sort of look on his face, saying, I cannot imagine the kind of tolerance that Sachin Tendulkar would have, because wherever he goes, whatever he does, there are just hundreds of people hounding him for this, that, and the other all the time, and the media and everything else. So it required a certain kind of toughness to withstand all of that for his 24-year international career. I must quickly mention perhaps Kapil Dev, who was tough in every possible aspect, bailing his team out of trouble with a ball or bat or fielding or catching or whatever. And of course, no complaints then, and remains, of course, just a wonderful guy so far, well, now as well, Kapil Dev. So just a couple of names to also throw into the mix. I wonder if you agree or not. But good guys can be hard men as well on the cricket field. You might have hardly noticed when watching the recent match between Chennai Super Kings and Kolkata Knight Riders in the IPL that the young ball boys outside the boundary line were actually wearing safety helmets. The boundaries are relatively small at Chepauk and a few other grounds at Chinnaswamy Stadium as well. So CSK implemented the rule to stop potential head injuries to all the youngsters who are inside or just outside the boundary, but well within range of all the shots that go there regularly, whether 6 or 4. And I wonder if you think it's a good idea, and it could be made compulsory in matches around the world. And of course, we talk about ball boys here, but perhaps, I don't know what we could do for the spectators, because the ball's just fly with crazy speeds, and we've been all watching the match. It could lead to some very serious injury, but I do hope that there's more attention given to safety. But that's all we've got for this week's Stumped. My thanks to Jim Maxwell and Nikesh Nugani, and to all of you for listening. We'll speak to you next week. Till then, goodbye.
Stumped is a BBC sport production for the BBC World Service in association with ABC and Akashvani.
You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Documentaries, telling the stories that shape us and our world.
I had not expected that this investigation was going to be so difficult for me.
Would I be able to get out of Afghanistan safe? Would not any member of the Taliban recognize me?
Documentaries on the BBC World Service at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your BBC podcasts. In 50 minutes, witness history.
With me, Vicky Farncombe. I'm taking you back to 1974, when Hiroo Onoda became the last Japanese soldier to surrender, nearly 30 years after the end of the Second World War.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to the Outlook Mixtape, the best of storytelling from the Outlook team. I'm Aussie Fuchs. Coming up today, the surfer who traveled the world and bigger waves. One day, He was invited to visit a small town on the coast of Portugal.
The first day we walked up to the edge of the cliff and saw the biggest waves I'd ever seen. I knew right then and there I found the biggest wave in the world, and it was just like the Holy Grail.
The discovery of the wave to beat all waves. And have you ever hung up on a really important call?
I was at home watching the end of a telenovela, a soap, when the phone rang. The other person on the other end says that they were calling from the United States, that I had won some kind of award. But I said, oh, we can talk later. I am watching my TV show. And I hung up.
The person calling was a representative of a global environmental prize. Fortunately, they called back. And we'll be back too, after the news.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. A political council has been established in Haiti to try to restore security and the rule of law. The US has welcomed its appointment, but Haiti still has far to go, as Will Grant reports.
The 9-person council, 7 of whom will have voting powers, must first be sworn in. There is some speculation that that could take place in the besieged National Palace, which has been under a barrage of gunfire for several weeks as powerful street gangs continue to hold a tight grip over the capital, Port-au-Prince. Once the members are sworn in, they will need to choose a president. The panel will also select and share power with a replacement for the outgoing Prime Minister, Ariel Henry. One of the main gang leaders, Jimmy Cherezier, has already said his group will not lay down their weapons unless they have some kind of voice at the negotiating table.
A former US ambassador has been sentenced to 15 years in prison by a US federal court in Miami. Victor Manuel Rocha admitted spying for Cuba for over 4 decades. Here's Sanjay Dasgupta.
A naturalized US citizen originally from Colombia, Victor Manuel Rocha began his double life as a Cuban covert agent in 1981, the same year he joined the US diplomatic service. He rose through the ranks as a career diplomat, ending up as the US ambassador to Bolivia and an advisor to the US military command responsible for Cuba. It was one of the longest-running infiltrations of the US government, which is why the presiding judge Beth Bloom told Mr. Rocha she would give him the maximum penalty permitted by law.
The US Vice President Kamala Harris has blamed Donald Trump for the loss of abortion rights in Arizona. The state's Supreme Court imposed a total ban on the procedure, upholding a law enacted 160 years ago. Ms. Harris said the former president wanted to take America back to the 19th century.
During his campaign in 2016, Donald Trump said women should be punished for seeking an abortion. And now, because of Donald Trump, more than 20 states in our nation have bans. Now, because of Donald Trump, 1 in 3 women of reproductive age in our country live in a state that has a Trump abortion ban.
Records of the US Democratic Party show that it paid at least $1.7 million to President Biden's lawyers from its legal funds when the president was facing an investigation into his handling of classified documents. The Republicans were quick to accuse the president of hypocrisy, as Mr. Biden has repeatedly criticized his predecessor, Donald Trump, for soliciting donor funds to pay his much larger legal fees. Democrats pointed out that not a single penny of grassroots donors' money had been spent on Mr. Biden's lawyers. This is the World News from the BBC. The United States and Britain have announced bans on the trading of Russian-produced metals on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the London Metal Exchange, 2 of the biggest of their type in the world. The US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, said the action would reduce Russian earnings while protecting America's partners and allies from what she called unwanted spillover effects. A court in Ecuador has ruled that the arrest of the country's former Vice President Jorge Glass last week was illegal, but said he must remain in jail due to his previous convictions. Mr. Glass, who's been imprisoned for corruption and faces fresh charges, was detained during a controversial raid on Mexico's embassy in Quito, where he had been living since December. The raid sparked a furious response from the Mexican government, who's seeking Ecuador's expulsion from the UN. Mr. Glass has said he'll appeal the court's ruling. Consumer price rises in Argentina have slowed for a 3rd consecutive month, though economic data reveals that annual price inflation still remains staggeringly high at almost 290%. the President, Javier Milei, has devalued the currency and introduced tough austerity. Tributes have been paid to the Italian fashion designer Roberto Cavalli, who's died at the age of 83. Fellow designer Giorgio Armani called him a true artist, while the singer Taylor Swift hailed his contribution to her look. Cavalli's style was enjoyed by the world's jet set for decades. He was known for using snakeskin and flamboyant animal prints, as well as transparent materials. Here he is talking about his way.
I love to design for young, beautiful girls. All the girls, they are beautiful if they're happy about what they wear.
Born in Florence, he pursued fashion from a young age, and by the 1970s, built a brand in his own name. That's the latest BBC News.
Welcome to this bonus edition of Outlook with me, Ossie Brooks, and some guest appearances from my fellow presenters.
Hello, it's Emily Webb here.
I'm Clayton Kahn in Argentina.
I'm Louise Morris, reporting from Uruguay. Hello, welcome to Outlook, the programme that puts a human face on the world. I'm Jo Fidgen.
At the end of every week, the Outlook team brings you a selection of the stories we've loved, our favorite moments from the program throughout the week. It's the Outlook Mixtape. Coming up today, a group of Argentinian mothers spot a disturbing pattern in their neighborhood. Two little blue birds go on a big adventure, and a girl from a trailer park hits the big time in Silicon Valley, only to find the unicorn company she's been working for is one giant fantasy. But first, we're catching some big waves.
You guys have a American coming, I don't know